Awesome. We made it. Last presentation, and probably one of the most important presentations that impact all of our Indigenous babies that are currently within the education system. So please lean in, pay attention, and be present. Dr. Aguilar is a professor at the University of Minnesota. Her areas of interest include Indigenous youth families and communities, indigenization, decolonization, visiting and storytelling, and culture identity. She is also a nationally certified school psychologist. Dr. Standing Eagle Bays is a professor at Benji State University, has been introduced many times today, but for this specific topic, it's really important to know how passionate he is about Indigenous students and providing culturally responsive approaches for Indigenous students' success within the classroom, outside of the classroom. He is currently the president-elect of SIP. So if you're a student, current, past, or thinking about going back to school, I'm going to tell you to come find him to talk to him so he can ensure your success, or, connect you with people or give you resources to be successful. Within the education system, that can be hard for us sometimes. And then finally, Valerie Von Bargen is a current student, a graduate student, been a graduate student for a while, and then recently was accepted to the Ph.D. program at the University of Minnesota in school psych. So she is a well-versed graduate student. And so if you're in graduate school and have any questions for her, she's going to be here. They are going to talk about Indigenous and allied perspective on the field of school psychology and really share some of their lived experiences within a predominantly white helping profession. And so it's going to be really important.
You'll notice we've had a presenter change. So the original folks that were on the presentation were Carol Robinson-Zañartu, who has been in school psychology for a long time and actually part of SIP for many, many years. So some of you might know her. And then Loren Houle, who is currently a practicing school psychologist who identifies as Native. I believe he's Turtle Mountain. And currently is a graduate student now in the PhD program. So I'm hoping I can get him into academia. But so those folks are obviously not here. We'll hear from Carol throughout the presentation. She was gracious enough to record some answers to some of the things that we'll talk about. But yeah, so we'll have just a different change in presenters. And then I'll just give a shout out while those slides are being brought up of different IAS members or Indigenous American subcommittee members. We'll kind of talk about the subcommittee a little bit who couldn't be here. Some were engaging in ceremony. And so there are some Native perspectives that aren't necessarily going to be represented here that we wish were here. So we want to give a shout out to those folks. And then this will be a little bit different than some of the presentations that you've all experienced thus far. So we'll have more of a moderated conversation. So Valerie, graduate student coming to work with me at Minnesota, will kind of ask Mark and I some questions, and then we'll give our responses to those things. And we invite you to ask audience questions throughout. So we want it to feel conversational and feel like you're kind of a part of this presentation with us. So we welcome that throughout. Looking forward to the next hour. Okay, and we got this information from nativeland.ca, which is what I use. Okay, so we're going to talk about our positionalities first and how those kind of drive the work that we do in school psychology. I actually want to ask, how many folks are familiar with school psychology? Just raise of hands. Oh, cool. I thought it was going to be like 3 people. Okay. Can anyone just shout out, or if there's a mic near you, a couple words to describe your understanding of school psychology? I want to kind of get a sense of, yeah. Yes. Consultation. Thank you. IEPs. Yes. Anybody else? Those are the 3 themes. Okay. So yes, thank you. Yeah, we're not school counselors, we're not guidance counselors, but we work with them.
I was gonna say hard work against the system.
Yeah, a lot of system. You'll talk. In programs we talk a lot about system change and kind of being changing. Yeah, good. Thank you. Okay, I just want to get a sense of what your perceptions were. So I'll give it over to Valerie to kind of talk about her positionality in the field as a graduate student.
Yeah, so we'll each have a chance to talk about our positionality a little bit, but I can get us started. So as mentioned, I'm a graduate student. I have been for probably too long at this point. So I'll introduce myself a little bit more professionally, and then take a second to kind of recognize like how I got here as a non-native person. So as Lisa mentioned, I'm going to be studying with her at the University of Minnesota, studying school psychology. I also work with her doing research, and we mentioned the Indigenous American Subcommittee through our national organization, which is the National Association of School Psychologists. So we're really working on decolonizing, indigenizing fields of education, psychology, and naturally school psychology. So to give you kind of an idea, I know we mentioned like assessment, consultation, but what I've been doing for the past 4 years as I continue my graduate school journey, I started at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I participated in some specialized training in autism, as well as the LEND training program, which is leadership education and neurodevelopmental and related disabilities. It's a whole mouthful. Then after earning my master's degree there, I continued on towards a doctorate. Haven't earned it yet, but working on it at the University at Albany, which is a SUNY systems school. While I was there, I taught an undergraduate course in positive youth development. I researched literacy and math interventions. And then I also worked for the New York State Education Department. They have this technical assistance partnership for academics. And they basically create professional development materials and do some coaching and consultation all over New York State related to like best practices for literacy, a little bit of math, mostly literacy, but evidence-based interventions for students. So that's kind of an idea of where I'm coming from professionally. And while I'm non-native, I'm very committed to promoting mental health of Indigenous youth, ensuring that they're afforded equitable educational opportunities. And before I dive into that, I kind of wanted to take a second, excuse me, I'm like reading off of this because I'm nervous and I don't want to miss anything here, but I wanted to take a second to just address my positionality as a non-native person who's interested in quote like native issues. I'm very cognizant of the fact that in doing this and taking this time, I'm a white woman taking up space in what's mostly an Indigenous space. But I'm also very cognizant of the fact that there's a very rightfully a mistrust of white professionals who are coming into these Indigenous spaces. And since you're, allowing me to speak on this platform, I really wanted to take a few moments to thank you for that, for inviting me into this space, and to really show you like what my intentions are in being here and doing this work. So my motivation really for engaging in this work with Indigenous communities, it stems from really this shared sense of humanity. I feel like that sounds very simple or maybe cliche, but I've never really felt a greater sense of reciprocity, this relatedness. And even in the past couple of days, just this honoring of being vulnerable and sharing like authentic moments with other people. Just frankly, humanness, other than when I'm with Indigenous peoples. And the way you all take your time. I know we made jokes yesterday about like running late and taking so much time, but the way that you all take your time and do things with such care is a need that I really don't see being met elsewhere. And I won't even begin to say that I understand the sense of biculturalism that you all feel on a daily basis. But I hope it's validating to say that I see you all doing it. I see you doing it here. I see it because you've welcomed me into spaces like this. I think a lot of other white practitioners don't get to see this side and they just are ignorant to it. And when I go out into like capitalist, colonialist world and other white people are like, well, why do you want to study Native issues? And it's like, oh, are you Native? Like they're confused when I say no. As if, I have to be Native to care about Native issues. And again, I'm realizing I'm taking up time, but I do want to thank you. I admire, the way that you all as Indigenous individuals have this ability to code switch, honoring and upholding your worldviews that are so different than that of like this mainstream society. And fascination really isn't the right word to use as a white person talking about Native people. But I'm more fascinated by that like ability to code switch and how, your brains can do that. So that's kind of how I became interested in, your culture. But when I began graduate school and I started learning about the disparities, one that really like sticks with me is that Indigenous youth are 30 times more likely to be expelled compared to their white peers. And that wasn't something that I was taught. I just kind of stumbled upon that on my own when I was looking at research. I don't really need to like lecture you on how detrimental that is, but we had discussed in graduate school like disproportionalities that Black students face, Latinx students, a variety of marginalized groups, but we never talked about Native youth. White people really seem to accept this narrative that like Indigenous populations, someone had mentioned it earlier, are just like not existent anymore in certain areas, or too small to be included in research. So they don't really search further than that to uncover the research that is being done that we're going to honor later in our presentation. So just with a statistic, like the one that I mentioned, I just really couldn't understand how this entire demographic kept being overlooked. So essentially, long story short, the authenticity of everything, of the culture, the biculturalism, the code switching, is what got me interested in doing this work. But it's really the vast disproportionalities that I saw within the field of school psychology that like drove me to be like, I need to do this. Yeah, I prepared a lot here because I didn't know how much time I was going to have. But I also wanted to highlight Mexi. She's an Indigenous activist at the University of Minnesota. She uses this term life-giving a lot. And when I heard that, I immediately like latched onto that. I recognized that that was like something I was looking for, something that I strive to be, and I didn't have a word for it. Just that sense of like invigoration and like stirring someone's soul and like giving them life. So I just felt really seen by Indigenous ways of being that I don't feel seen in other ways. So I really wanted to, bridge this divide and ultimately like bring your voices with me when I'm in white spaces, and use my privilege rather than just acknowledge it, but actually put it to use, and hopefully lessen the burden on you and enable your voices to be heard by people who might not otherwise listen or be in these spaces. So again, thank you for, allowing me to take up this space. I know when we were preparing this presentation, I had spoke with both of you about how I was glad to be taking more of the moderator role and to really center, Indigenous voices and not be up here sharing my story. And I'm grateful to Mark, you continue to validate me and share how my voice is still valued. Particularly considering how the majority of school psychologists, look like me and are white females. So I hope that hopefully it can be a little bit reassuring to hear that there are allies in that field, allies who care enough to transfer graduate programs and like continually be in graduate school and be poor for a really long time, to do all of that in order to feel competent enough to like serve this population. Yeah, so that's where I'm coming from. And I thought it was important, given that our work is driven by our positionalities, to share that with you, and share my intentions. Do either of you want to go next?
I guess I didn't tell you we were going to do that. So this is a identity wheel, and I use this often in classes and different presentations. I'll have the audience kind of talk through some of their most salient identities that are coming up for them in the current moment. So for me, I think something that's coming up is like socioeconomic status. So as a Native woman in this field, there was a really fast change in income over the past 5 years, right? From internship to being, a graduate student being below the poverty line, and then going to internship and feeling like $30,000 was a lot of money, right? And then kind of like the vast change in income that comes with being an academic, and the privilege, and also the way I was able to help and support my family because of that, right? And so I think a lot about socioeconomic status in my positionality as an academic, and I try to be mindful of that going into Native communities that I'm not from, because it gives me access to spaces that I likely wouldn't have access to if I wasn't a faculty member. The other part of my identity that's really coming out for me is geographic location. So I am at the University of Minnesota, which is on Osheti-Shakopee land, the land of my ancestors. And so to be really close to that land and the history and the really rich historical context of activism that has happened there has been really healing for me, and something that I've been thinking about and trying to learn more and read a lot and talk to people on the ground about different things and learn more about the survival schools and those sorts of things. And then lastly, my race and ethnicity are always at the forefront for me, especially in a predominantly white field. So being in a space like this is quite healing, because I only experienced one moment when I was working in the schools as a school psychologist, when the number of Native people outnumbered the number of non-Native people. And it was in an IEP meeting. So we were talking about deficits of the child, but the fact that we had both parents, the child themselves, myself, and a Native teacher, and then maybe 3 admin who are all white men, like was kind of, the moment wasn't lost on me, right? That was the first time as a professional that I was in a space like that. And it was very profound. And so to be in these types of spaces, that doesn't happen often for me. And so I really appreciate being here. So Mark, do you want to share anything about your positionality, or do you want to jump into the question? You want to jump in?
Yeah, you've been up here. Okay, so it sounds like a lot of people are familiar with school psychology, which is great. We weren't really sure what to expect. So from your perspective, each of your perspectives, and your positionality within the field, can you provide us with an overview of school psychology?
For me, just thinking about this position, what it means is really this relationship that I'm building with the students and the families, and using myself as a conduit, if you will, to partner with the institution. And someone didn't mention, what do you think when you think of school psychology? I always felt like I always went into the schools that I needed a referee shirt, where I had the parents yelling at the school and the schools yelling at the parents. And I felt like I was in the middle, really trying to bring some reason of how we can all work together. But just thinking about school psych and making that connection with the families is a multidisciplinary approach for the success of the student and their success, not only in their academics, but in their social emotional steps in life. So I always look at this position as a healing position to bring a team together, again, for the sake of the success of the child's academic as well as the social emotional. And this collaborative approach I've seen become extremely successful when we can all work together, when we can listen to one another, but having that space where parents are heard from majority of non-native counselors, teachers, administrators, hasn't always been an easy task, but I knew it was important to weave in Western approaches and traditional methodologies for the student and their success. So going into school psych wasn't as nice as I thought it would be, because I knew the majority of the individuals that I was working with were non-Indigenous. And I didn't really feel like I had a voice initially because I was different, and that's your way. But when we started working with the majority of Indigenous people, I felt more empowered to say, this is our way. And it's an opportunity for each of us to work closely together as students, again, as families, and as institutions.
Thank you. And we have a video from Carol Robinson that I'll play before I kind of share my thoughts. So it should, I'm gonna press play, it should play. Oh, you have the PDF. I didn't realize that. So we won't be able to hear from Carol. I thought this is a Canva presentation, but you can see her. Yeah. You can see her. I didn't think that went through. I thought I was going to be able to connect to mine. Okay, we'll skip that because I think we're also kind of low on time too. So I'll just give my perspective. So from just to give an overview of school psychology, it sits at the intersection of education and psychology. So we're really kind of grabbing from both of those fields and integrating that into our work in schools. And so when I entered the field, I was really socialized to view school psychology as like a database, quote unquote, field with universal objective truths. And those universal objective truths were cognitive assessment gives accurate representation of intelligence, right? We lean heavily on that. We live in the world of special education, and part of special education is finding the weakness in kids. And so we often rely on intelligence tests to do that, which we all know the history of those. Another objective truth in school psychology is that learning takes place in graduate programs, right? There's a hierarchy of you have to get an undergraduate degree, and then you have to go on to get your specialist at the minimum, which is a master's plus 30 in order to be proficient enough to practice in the schools, right? And then there's all these kind of certification tests that you can do. So it's very hierarchical in terms of learning, right? And like I sit down as the faculty and I'm expected to pour knowledge into you. The funds of knowledge that graduate students come into the program with aren't honored, right? The other thing that we like heavily rely on as a field are observations, right, of what we expect or what we deem to be appropriate behavior. We rely pretty heavily on rating scales, and oftentimes those aren't given to students. That's not necessarily like a predominant practice. You know, we tend to do it, but it's not something that's like expected all the time, right, or taught necessarily. We also rely heavily on clinical interviews. So we borrow a lot from clinical psychology and try to model ourselves after that field in many ways. But oftentimes in the schools, it doesn't always drive, right? And so again, we rely heavily on these like standardized assessments and the fact that yearly progress really determines like who is successful and who is not successful. And then the way that we define success is very Western focused, right? And then one of the other objective truths is that we are the experts, right? School psychologists are the experts in the school. They're the people who know how to interpret data. And school psychology really rests on this idea that we have to save the child. So back in like the 1960s or whenever mandatory schooling and all of that became a thing, and then school psychology sort of was birthed out of that mandatory schooling sort of era or movement. And we were really positioned as like this child saving field, and it like feels really like gross and white savory, right? And so kind of part of what I see is like that's a universal truth for many school psychologists, but trying to push back against that is what I find myself doing a lot. So just to kind of give you more context, I started graduate school in 2013, and at that time we were only required to take one multicultural course, which really employed the zoo approach, which was like, here are Black folks, here are Asian folks, here are Appy folks, here's Native folks, right? And we used the Sue et al. Book to do that. And that course was offered outside the school psychology program. So we didn't even offer anything that was specific. What? Yeah, and that's still the experience today. And I can, in my program, count on one hand the number of times that race was actually considered in regards to service provision in schools outside of that multicultural class. And to kind of give you even more context, I was the only Indigenous student in the entire duration of graduate school, as I know many of you also have that same experience. And so there's definitely a consistency among like graduate programs, specifically in psychology, right, in terms of like the experience that Native students have. So I wasn't really encouraged to bring my full cultural self to what it means to be a school psychologist. I was trained in a very specific way, and it wasn't until my dissertation that I began to kind of consider like how important culture is, right? Because I quickly realized like the work I did early on was academic interventions. And I was like, this is fine. But you can't intervene your way out of oppression or racism or suicide, right? Like some of these kind of like broader sociopolitical like topics, you can't really like consult your way out of or intervention your way out of. And so I really had to kind of grapple with what that means. And so that's why with my dissertation, I started really focusing on cultural identity, which not many folks were doing in school psychology at all. I know in education more broadly, there's a lot of Native scholars who do that, but in school psychology, it was very, very minimal, if any. I would say Carol was like the researcher that was kind of spearheading a lot of that in school psych. So today I have the privilege of chairing the Indigenous American Subcommittee, which Valerie shared as a part of the National Association of School Psychologists. And so through that position, I really kind of learned that women of color continue to be tokenized to achieve the sort of surface level social justice ideal in the field that the field is trying to reach. And our organizations continue to like act as colonizers. So like when we meet as a subcommittee, oftentimes we have a representative from the broader organization of NASP come and sit in our meetings and like sort of report back to the broader board of directors. And it feels really like Indian agent-y, right? And I voiced those opinions before, and there isn't ever really a response, but it just kind of giving you an idea of what it's like to sort of be in school psychology in these institutions. So for my social vocation, school psychology really believes that we can, intervene, consult, assess our way out of all of these things, and maybe sprinkle some DEI on it. But we did a study, a systematic review that was published this past year, and really what that found is like, in terms of representation within research in school psychology, most of the research, there was only 57 studies, and most of the research was done in the 1980s. So there's really not anybody doing a lot of work on this, and the topics tended to be assessment. So the fact that somebody said assessment as the first thing they thought of when I say school psychology is quite funny. And so in terms of equity, like disproportionality was a thing that's most studied, right? So we see that there's this really like deficit focused lens on the research that is happening in school psychology. And then as far as demographics, there's less than 1% Native folks, and that's including like Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander folks in our field.
Yeah, so along those lines of most of the research in the field being deficit-based or about disproportionalities, and there's like a lack of research at all, right? Like you mentioned, Carol is doing research in school psychology, Lisa is, and Anissa at the University of Montana. Those are like the three that I can think of in our subfield of psychology. So given that it's deficit-based and there's not a lot of it, we wanted to highlight either review your own work, but also the work of others that we admire and want to honor. And before I pass it off, I'll just quickly highlight that Lisa's doing a lot of research and thinking about like joy and Indigenous joy. And honestly, that was like a new concept for me in research, because so much of it that I have seen is about disproportionality, deficits, historical trauma, which obviously these things are important to recognize, but we're missing like the entire joy and resistance piece of it. Yeah.
This is kind of a funny question because it just sounds like, hey, you want to talk about things you can show off, right? What? One of the things that I am very excited about, not only being surrounded by amazing colleagues and mentors, but to truly drive something that I truly believe in is incorporating culturally responsive approaches to IEPs. When I don't remember in 2008, IEPs incorporated more culturally responsive or even psych evals or psych ed evals. And today I have the opportunity to incorporate that with a method that I developed. And I keep thinking of Tim, you really didn't develop it. It wasn't your idea. So I think it was just going old school, and it's called the sweetgrass method, and it's weaving in our traditional ways of knowing with Western approaches for the clients that we're serving. And we acknowledge a lot of the methods, Western-based, that have a lot of promise, right, that are evidence-based, and it may work over there. But utilizing something that I started using in 2007, but didn't know what to call it, was saying, you have a really great instrument, it just doesn't work for our people. And what I was hearing at the time was, maybe your people don't want any help. Maybe that's why it's not working. So I felt like, well, okay, it's our fault then. But I keep using this analogy. Our people are hungry for joy, for happiness, for strength. And what you're serving isn't anything that we like. So why don't we get a native chef in there and add our own ingredients and see how many people come into the restaurant and eat? And it's making me hungry right now. So this and again, respectively speaking, I'm just so thrilled because it wasn't just me. But the sweetgrass method is now something that SAMHSA, Substance Abuse Mental Health Service Administration, is now using. I didn't even know. Aren't they supposed to call you and let you know? But they're using this for bullying prevention and intervention approaches with Indigenous populations. And having this opportunity to say that we may have a seat at the table, that we do have an obligation is something that I continue to remind myself of things that are happening. And it goes with the culturally responsive approach. I hear that word quite often, culturally responsive, but no action. So what does it mean? I'm being culturally sensitive. No, you're just being sensitive, but how are you responding culturally? Yeah, so are we to acknowledge whose work we want, or is that the second question? Okay, well, I'll just.
Yeah, we really wanted to highlight like who in school psychology has kind of been doing some of these things. And as Valerie mentioned, Carol Robinson-Zañartu, who's been mentioned several times, Anissa Goforth and Laura Henderson are all working pretty intimately with different tribal and Native community nations throughout the U.S. And I also want to recognize that those are not Native folks, right? And I think that is, again, representative of our field, those are predominantly non-Native. But I also wanted to highlight the Indigenous, and bummed, you can't even Carol, the Indigenous American Subcommittee's work. And so the Indigenous American Subcommittee within NASP, it falls under the Multicultural Affairs Committee. So it's kind of similar to the structure that SIP is under with APA. And this subcommittee was founded by Paul Dauphiné. I don't even know when. It's been at least 30 years, I think, from what Carol has told me. So he really saw a need. And I think he was a past SIP president. Yeah, so he's been connected. And then I think tried to, replicate really what you all were doing here within APA in NASP, and really saw a need for that. And so he kind of spearheaded the subcommittee, and Elvina Charlie, who's a Dene woman, took over for many, many years. And then most recently, Jacob Price, who is Pawnee, and I think he's in Colorado, and they're all practitioners. So within our field, a lot of the practitioners are driving the really meaningful work that has been done. And one of the things that's come out of the subcommittee is this, what we call the Indigenous Conceptual Framework. And we've developed this to serve as a guide to school psychologists for how to engage in, sorry, Mark, the culturally responsive practice within Native youth and families. And other articles that Paul has led kind of describe how to use this in practice. And so this conceptual framework really addresses like culture identity at the center, right? So I think most people say it looks like a dream catcher. I don't think it was intended actually to look that way, which is really funny, but it does. And so you see here at the center is culture and identity, right? And so that's supposed to act as the sun, and that really kind of nourishes everything that we do. And the blue represents the water, so the different kind of components of school psychology practice. But then you see the red and the black stars that kind of represent some of these other concepts that many Indigenous communities sort of embody in their ways of being, which are things like intentionality and reciprocity and other things that even Valerie had mentioned at the beginning. But the idea here is to incorporate all of those things in the pursuit of empowering Native youth and families, but also centering culture and identity in everything that we do in schools with Native youth. And then the bottom feathers here sort of represent the different organizations that are involved in this work as we see it from the field of school psychology. And so we really tried to make non-Native school psychologists aware that this framework exists so that they can utilize it to support the students that they work with, because it's very common that, or it's not very likely that a Native student would have a school psychologist that looks like them, right? And so we see part of our position as a subcommittee is to put out resources that would help non-Native practitioners support Native students. And then I think this is quite interesting. This has been worked on probably since like 2013. So they were still working on it when I was a graduate student at one of the NAS conventions, and it was published in 2020. And why this is funny is because on the left here is the practice model for NASP in 2010, and then it changed in 2020 after we published ours. So there's like some similarities between those, right? So Elvina Charlie got like really mad and she's like, they ripped us off. Like they stole our circular, like now they're, so it's just quite interesting, right? So even at the organizational level, they're kind of doing things that show the coloniality, the colonial mindset of like, oh, that's a good idea. Let me take it and let's kind of use that, but not give proper credit, right? So I just wanted to poke fun at them. And then so there's some work that I'm really excited about that I can kind of briefly share. One of them is with Laura Henderson, IAS subcommittee member. We did a game design camp with some Dakota youth last summer, and that was really, really cool. Where we kind of blended, we taught them game design, but then we blended that with like traditional games like lacrosse and hand moccasins and like stuff like that, the moccasin game. And that was really cool. So we're writing that stuff up, that project up right now, and hopefully that'll be out soon. I'm not gonna go into this. This is yeah, I'm not gonna go into that. Okay, well, just for the sake of time, we'll get to this.
So whose work I'd like to highlight, and Lisa had shared with a lot of wonderful colleagues that I do embrace and very honored to have a part of that circle. And there's some individuals here that I steal a lot of their work. I do cite sources. But Dr. Joe Gahn, a lot of, speaking of culturally responsive approaches, and Dr. Jackie Gray, a lot of her research and endless efforts to truly approach our people in a way where we appreciate the ingredients of that meal. I'm going back to the food. That we have that seat and are able to sit with and break bread, if you will. But there's something that I do want to acknowledge, that a lot of what I'm seeing and what I am learning, I'm not sure if I shared it with this person, but one of the leading psychology textbooks that just came out on multicultural psychology, understanding our diverse communities, is my colleague, Dr. John Gonzalez. And his book, they just came out, he was a co-author. So we have amazing people among us. And I know I'm very honored and blessed to sit and to be in the same building as him, and I've learned so much from your leadership. Even your pain continues to motivate me to do better. And when I saw that you came out with this book, I was not only honored and excited, but I really wanted to yell with so much joy. And I did ask you to borrow that book, and I haven't given it back either. I have it in my office. But that's someone whose work that I wanted to definitely highlight. And I hope that I continue to connect with colleagues that continue to do amazing work.
Thank you. All right, so moving on to our next question here, and this is a big one, but how do you both confront the field's coloniality to better support not only like Native youth and parents that you serve, but also graduate students that you prepare and the broader organizations that you operate within?
That is a big question. And I didn't bring John's book to cheat. But one of the things is to look at how we change teaching approaches, teaching methods. If we use more inclusive pedagogies, right, like open-ended, multilingual, multicultural practices, we begin that process. Also, design assessments. When's the last time we had a true Indigenous assessment for Indigenous by Indigenous? So that would be something else to do. More importantly, to involve our students in the process. This is the first year, and again, thanks to John, my colleague, that we are offering, or maybe this isn't the first, but we're offering Introduction to School Psych at BSU. And I do have some students that were here, and I was talking about some professors really not being flexible, you know, when they're going to ceremony and they're having to turn in their papers. And I was looking for some of my students, and where are they? And they're saying, well, they're having to turn in your paper that they're working on. So I was humbled really quick. But also possibly looking at using trauma-informed approaches, and how we can face and make those changes when we're confronted with opposition like that. So when discussing sensitive topics, such as colonization, using trauma-informed teachings to help our students process their feelings, or do we just dismiss it? You know, how can we validate? And if you were here earlier, just the empowering words that our students were giving, it was coming from the heart. This is what I'm dealing with. And I am glad that we can record it, because I would love to share this with all our faculty at BSU to understand some of the obstacles and to be more sensitive.
So I think where it starts for me is, we could have heard some more out too. If you want the videos, I'd be happy to show them to you. So I think where it starts for me is with theory. I really rely on critical theory that is grounded in Indigenous epistemologies. And so probably the theory that everyone is familiar with is tribal critical race theory. And as you may also know, that was created by Boy, who is a Lumbee scholar. And the first tenet in that theory of 9 is that colonialism is endemic to society. And I apply that to school psychology by saying colonialism is endemic to school psychology and then also to schools. So I was really lost before tribal crit. I didn't have a way to sort of come to an understanding of why the things I was seeing in school were happening. And I will often display this slide at the beginning of different talks that I do, because I really want to make clear to audiences. I was just talking to an audience of school counselors, and I showed them this, and they had a lot of questions about, like, well, how are school lunches colonial? And I was like, well, what types of foods are y'all serving here, right? Or like, how are bell schedules colonial? And one of the examples I always give is like, well, when I go to sweat ceremony, like back home, it doesn't start until everybody gets there. Right. So we might give like a time or whereabouts, like when to be there. But, you know, even if the last person gets there like 2 or 3 hours later, we're going to wait for them. Right. And that's not how schools operate for a myriad of reasons. So I think the first key for me is really relying on theory to kind of illuminate some of the things that are happening in school. And I kind of already mentioned, like, special education is really embedded in this like colonial thinking, and just the fact that our schools are predominantly English speaking, right? We don't really offer native languages, even at the high school level. They're often like colonial languages, Spanish, French, right? Those sorts of things. So I really try to use theory to kind of understand things like boarding schools and why that happened. I also try to incorporate Indigenous feminism because it's an intersectional theory and practice of like thinking about what it means to decolonize something and thinking about what Indigenous sovereignty means, but also the intersection of what it means for those movements to be gendered, right? And what that looks like in our communities, and are human rights really women's rights, right? And like, where is the breakdown in different communities? And so trying to embody those theories as my praxis when I go and teach and do research and all of those things. So I really rely on critical theory to confront what's happening in the field as I see it. The other thing that I try to do is engage in critical research. So I'm a part of we call ourselves the Just Lab, but we're all women of color scholars in school psychology. I'm the only Native. There's also an Indian woman, Creole woman, and a Black woman. And one of the things that we do, we get together weekly to kind of visit, story tell, but also talk about research. And one of the things that came out of this lab, I'm not on this paper, but it's seminal to our field, I think, is that we actually named, or they actually named, school psychology as a colonizer. And that was the first paper to do that in our field. And I think people are really using that to kind of do some work in their respective universities and areas. But just doing this type of research, right? So like what they talk about in that paper is that as school psychologists, we label students. So we diagnose them, and we have to do that in order to provide services, right? So part of labeling is gatekeeping from other students, services that might support them. And so we can't help quote unquote a student unless they're disabled, right? Or at least that's how we're trained. And so to subvert some of those systems is something we're trying to do. But then we can also think about this idea of like promoting compliance. And if folks are familiar with like multi-tier systems of support or positive behavior interventions and supports, those things are often modeled after white norms and expectations, right? White supremacy is very much embedded in some of those expectations. And the fact that we sort of uphold that, right? As school psychologists, that's our expectation of ourselves, is to kind of uphold those different behavioral practices that include like discipline, right? And things like that. So engaging in critical research. I recently did a collaborative autoethnography project with some students from a university that I was at prior to Minnesota, where we created a virtual counter space and engaged in storytelling with one another, so that we could find commonalities amongst our experiences. And again, name school psychology as the colonizer, because once we do that, we start to understand that school psychology is sick with colonialism. And then what do we do when there's a sickness, right? There's always medicine that we can do, right? And so I think of the medicine as being like decolonization and indigenization and those sorts of things, and practices that kind of fall under those like broad categories. And then I'll say the third thing, what I try to do to confront coloniality within the field, I don't know if I have a slide on this, is to engage in this like multi-prong approach to learning. So I try to engage on a regular basis, podcasts, articles, books, films, going out on the land, but probably most importantly, going back to Indigenous feminism, is centering Indigenous women in my learning. So seeking out people like my mom, who we haven't always had the best relationship, but as I've gotten older, I've realized there's a lot of wisdom that comes with her lived experiences, and learning from those and taking those into the university, right, has been really important to me. And I've sort of come to this understanding within myself, engaging in this multi-pronged learning, that school psychology probably can't really be decolonized because it's inherently colonial. And so thinking about ways to indigenize in a way that's not appropriative, in a way that non-Native allies can sort of come along with us to support Native youth and families. So yeah, share for that.
Yeah, before we move on to the next question, no, you're fine. I also just wanted to chime in a little bit as a student, because I think, confronting coloniality is really hard when you don't really have a lot of power. Like, you're not a professor, you're not a practitioner, you're still learning, particularly like when you're a practicum student and you're sort of a guest in a school district. It's like, how do I really assert myself? Because I don't really have power in this dynamic. So I think a lot of like the resistance that I engage in takes the form of advocacy and trying to speak up to people in power. And again, this can be hard when you're a student, but honestly, I think sometimes being a student is helpful, because you can, more naturally ask questions under the guise of like, I want to learn more about this. When in reality, maybe I'm asking someone to reconsider like what they're doing, but I can be like, tell me more about why you decided to do that, just so I can learn. Or, being a student can be helpful because it's more natural maybe for me to make suggestions. I've had a lot of supervisors who are like, well, you're always up to date on the most up-to-date research coming out. You learn things in your program that I'd love it if you'd share that with me. So you can kind of bring it up in that way. Like, rather than trying to assert your position over someone else, like when you're a professional, I think sometimes it might be a little bit easier as a student, ironically. Like, for example, coming to mind for me is an experience that I had last year. I was working as an intern practicum student. They called it intern for some reason, even though I wasn't really like full-time. But I was in a school district and we had a native student who had just, he was new to our district. He came from Onondaga land, which is near Syracuse, New York. The student was due for a special education evaluation, and the family had had their son evaluated for autism like outside of the school setting. And that had been done in the past, but we needed, there's a whole process in place, right? Of like, if you have an outside evaluation, the school has to reevaluate and do it, their way. So the family had requested that the previous clinician conduct the current evaluation. And my supervisor and a lot of the other school staff, they were really frustrated, confused as to why they were like making this request. They kind of took it as a sign of disrespect of like, they're not following our process. Like, are we not good enough to do this evaluation for you? Without, taking a step back or just even really having an understanding at all, or knowing like what questions to ask, or even having enough perspective to think like, okay, maybe we can see how school systems are traumatizing for this family, historically or in the present day. How we can't trust school professionals necessarily, or how relationality is just so central for that family that they'd want to drive over 2 hours to get an evaluation from someone they trust. So that's just one example that comes to mind. But as a student, I have the opportunity to ask my supervisor, like, where is this frustration coming from? Have you thought about maybe this that the family might be experiencing? So just trying to speak up and like share the knowledge that I do have. Because a lot of times, I think, especially in white spaces, people just don't know and they make assumptions because they don't know. Not saying that that's okay to make those assumptions, but it happens. And sometimes just providing knowledge can help with that. So just for all you students out there. Our final question though, I was hoping that each of you could tell us about your practices of resistance, joy, humor, the good stuff that sustains your practice, your research, your advocacy, and your service.
What? I was going to jump right into joy because I know laughter is medicine. Resistance would be communication and education, right? Refusal is instantaneously a negation as an entry to communicating the resources. If I don't agree, if we don't speak up, God won't even hear us, right? So if we don't agree, it's important that we use our voice to speak up. As far as joy, have a positive mindset. My son always leaves a text message: peace, love, and positivity, Dad. Peace, love, and positivity. So I try to do my best to live by that. As far as wellness and promoting wellness, try to encourage myself and others in activities that can improve my physical and emotional wellness, like what does that call? Powwow yoga. You call it powwow yoga? That's pretty good. That's pretty good. John? Right? John's one of the teachers. Recognizing strengths. People who use their strengths, right, at work are likelier to be engaged and perform well. And the way I look at how we continue to advocate for those that cannot advocate for themselves, as I shared during the weekend retreat, my dad was telling me, you have an obligation. Before my sister crossed over, she says, you have an obligation for our people, for our family. So I know I want to continue to fight this good fight and advocate for those that cannot advocate for themselves. And I just wanted to say, lastly, important research that's been done on SEL, right, social emotional learning, and something that just came out that I just felt like it was a miss. Why is social emotional learning not working with a lot of Indigenous communities, American Indian, Alaska Native? Why is that? So we did some research and we found out that how can we sit down and have a relationship if we don't even start with the relationship? We want to get right into the emotions, and the individuals, the families, the students are saying, you don't even know me like that to ask me those questions. So we went a little further back and looked at cultural emotional learning to start with the relationship of who they are and honoring where they come from. And just another plug, APA magazine that came out, Dr. Jackie Gray, I was talking to her, she goes, you know, you're in that magazine, and this article that you and my wife, Allison, published is a resource for psychologists throughout the United States to look at cultural emotional learning prior to social emotional learning. And it just came out. So they didn't tell us either that they were going to do this. So we didn't get paid. Nope. But other than that, I am just in an amazing position to make change. And I want to continue that drive and that force to bring peace, love, and positivity.
Okay, so I'll talk about my practices of joy, because as Valerie mentioned, something that I've been concerned a lot with lately is like Indigenous joy, and what does that mean, and how do we recenter that? So how I try to center joy in my life to sustain the work that I do is by engaging in animal relations, plant relations, right? So this picture is of my relative Nico, and he's in the waters of the Mijigama. So I took this picture of him. He travels with me when he can. So like if it's in driving distance. So this is in Bemidji when Mark invited me to talk to the Insight students, which is a really, really wonderful trip. And we got there the night before, kind of late, and I let him run on the beach. And he went in the water and just was like really still. So I was just kind of watching him and taking pictures because he's a little bit older. He's 10 years old. I've had him since I was a first year grad student. And so he means a lot to me. And I kind of was talking to Mark the next day at in your office, and you had talked to me about, like, you had told me the story about the waters and how they're healing. And I was like thinking about it. I was like, I wonder if Nico knew. And that's why he was standing in there, because he doesn't really like water. And so I felt like he was kind of like teaching me something, like in that moment, like take time, bless yourself, like you're here for a reason, those sorts of things. So I try to be really attuned to my animal relations. I do have another dog too, but we're kind of like mortal enemies at this point. He likes to get on my nerves. So I don't have a picture of him, but I could show somebody later. He's a cattle dog beagle, so he's like really loud and can be obnoxious sometimes. But Migo, we've known each other for 10 years, right? So longer than I've even been with my partner, and known many people. So he's really important to me. So I really try to cultivate that relationship, and I try to bring that also into my teaching of like, here's an example of how we don't center these types of relations in school psychology, right? It's very human to human and transactional and hierarchical. And what would it look like if we did center things like this? I also try to cultivate a relationship with plants, especially being in an urban area like Minneapolis and living in an apartment. I had to put a lot. I'm still thinking about like, how do I engage in a really meaningful relationship with plants? So one of the things that I'm trying to do is grow mini cucumbers. So that's on the right there. So I germinated them with my mom. She was kind of like helping me through it. We planted them. I think I have one that is surviving right now, that I hopefully is being watered while I'm here. And so trying to, just cultivate that relationship and like, not always buying food from the store, and like knowing where my food comes from, and all of that, right? And then trying to do that while being like an urban Indian, and kind of thinking through some of those things, and how those relationships are different when you live somewhere like Minneapolis. And then I also just try to center taking lots of trips to see my family. So again, I mentioned at the beginning, like socioeconomic status is something that's really coming up for me as of late. And because of that, I'm able to travel and really privileged enough to do that. And so in this picture down here at the bottom is my little baby named Nima. So she is a friend of my dad's daughter, but they take care of her. And she is just like the best little girl. I don't have kids, but I'm like, I love Kit, and she's like the best. She's so smart and all these things, and she brings me lots of joy. And this is a picture of her. I was doing a Zoom meeting, and she was really sitting there like kind of watching, pretending she was coloring, but like watching me and being my coworker for the day. So anytime I can take trips but like still be working and like kind of have those two like in sync with one another really gives me a lot of joy. And then this picture of these pecans in the middle there. So my dad lives in New Mexico, and that's something that they go out and harvest, and they have like a relationship with the trees in their backyard and that sort of thing. And so we often will like sit and story tell around different things, and folks might be aware of like other sort of nuts like piñons and stuff like that. So that's very like heavily kind of emphasized in my family. And then this top picture was a picture of a thunderstorm that was I was able to see from my balcony. And so it kind of just reminded me of like in our culture, we talk about like the thunder beings coming and kind of representing renewal and regrowth and, you know, changing of seasons and all of that thing. So I tried to kind of find micro moments in my day-to-day life where I sort of remind myself here, like the little joys, right? And like hold on to those. The other thing, oh, and then this is my, I don't know why I don't want to talk about that. This is my mom. My mom on the left and my brother. So this is a picture of her in Santa Barbara because she came with me. I do some adjuncting at a Pacifica Graduate Institute. They have a really cool program there, actually. It's Community Liberation Indigenous Eco-Psychologies. And I love teaching for them because I learned so much from the students, and I bring that back to school psychology because we're not doing any of that. But this is a picture of her in the water because she had never seen the ocean. And so I think it's just a good representation of, I try to bring her to places that I have access to that she might normally not, right? So she comes and she sits in the classroom with me. She's been on University of Minnesota campus many times, come and visited the students. She's been to many talks. She'll give me notes on like, if I'm talking too fast or like, I couldn't really understand you, right? Like I really value that feedback, and I can tell it brings her a lot of joy to be in those spaces, right? And so she means a lot to me. And then that's my brother, my youngest brother there on the right, Cameron. And so they bring me a lot of joy. And then as far as like, oh, I saved that. No, okay, I'll save that. And then as far as practices of resistance, something I've been thinking about a lot lately is not in the spaces that I'm in that are predominantly white, not engaging in performative indigeneity, right? Because I think in a lot of these like predominantly white institutions and things like that, they will easily tokenize you and are happy to do it, and then expect you to perform how they want you to perform, right? So if I show up in a ribbon skirt and I, you know, do my greeting or whatever, they love that. And because they love that, I try not to perform that for them, right? I try to perform it when it feels good for me. And so that's how I engage in some resistance. I also try to do it in terms of like this idea of respectability politics, right? So when you like put your tenure materials up, or when you're like engaging in advising relationships, like what I try to do is sort of like subvert what that means to the academy. So like in my tenure materials, I'm really clear of like, I'm doing this from a relational perspective. I engage in visiting with my students. I am not teaching in a hierarchical way, or I try not to. And being clear and upfront and getting support from my fellow faculty members who do have tenure in saying, yeah, you should say those things. Because that's what they, you know, that's what people in the department or, you know, deans or whatever need to hear. And then thinking about how I'm engaging with advisees and how I want that to be more of like this, be more grounded in visiting and getting to know and being relational, right? And I don't know, maybe Valerie can tell you more about that. But and then some of the other things I try to do to sort of resist in different spaces are asking like difficult and uncomfortable questions. So things like interrupting. We had a conversation about space allocation at the university. So there's lots of folks that are pissed off that they don't have the office that they used to have, or this person has a closet that locks, and this person has this view of the river, right? Because we're right on the river. And I'm just sitting there in this Zoom meeting, kind of listening to all these things that people are saying. And I sort of just said, I just want to say one thing, and that is that like this conversation is like really grounded in like this colonial thinking, right? And like, I just want to name that. So like, you don't have to respond to it, but I just want to like put that out there and let you sit with it. So I try to sort of disrupt some of these conversations that are happening, even though it feels wildly uncomfortable and I'm not tenured. I still try to challenge myself to do that in some of those spaces, because I know like I'm the only one, and I'm happy to do that. And I feel like that's part of my role as being in school psychology. And then just being really transparent and honest with advisees and graduate students and other early career folks, especially women of color, about like who's safe in the field and who's not, who's going to tokenize you and who's not, what to watch out for, and those sorts of things. Some people might call it gossip, but I call it sustaining the community, right? So that we see them through to graduation. So I think it's important to sort of, yeah, be transparent and be honest in those ways. And then lastly, in terms of resistance, I try to be really mindful of language that I use, because I believe that language is medicine. And I think that you can write or speak good or bad medicine. And so I think like using phrases like the land that is now known as Utah, right? Or the land that is now known as Minnesota, and avoiding language of ownership. I just had a conversation in South Dakota with a non-native school psych faculty who was saying something about like South Dakota's indigenous tribes. They don't belong to South Dakota, right? They were here before South Dakota was a state. Okay. Okay, so I can go on and on, but like trying to be really mindful of language, right? And that sort of thing. And then the last thing I'll share is just, this was actually a meme that I shared at my job talk. So I said, again, like, I'm not going to perform indigeneity for you, right? You want me to give a land acknowledgement. You want me to say some words in Lakota, Dakota, whatever. But I'm not going to do that. I'm going to show you this meme. You can laugh or not. I might get the job. I might not. I ended up doing it. Amanda Sullivan, our program director, said it may or may not have been because of the meme. Like we saw that, like we were like, yes, love the meme. So this is just another example of like the humor that I try to engage in, integrate. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, thank you. Yay.
I just wanted to comment on what you guys talked about with kind of like protecting your time and like not being like a token. And I've been really struggling with like knowing when to say no to things. And at my university, like my PI is really great about discussing all of my ideas and like making sure that I do protect my time. But sometimes I do feel like I'm being pulled in like 15 different directions, and it can really feel like I'm the only one like kind of pulling the weight on certain things. And so I've been really trying to say no to certain things and really protect like the things that I want to work on versus like the things that they want me to do, to kind of like make the university like look really diversified. And I was asked to be head woman dancer for our powwow last year, and it was one of the higher ups outside of the American Indian Center who was like, we need our head staff to be native, and they need to do this and they need to do that, and they tried to like kind of control like what we were doing. And I was like, if you want me to do that thing, I need to do it like my way and in my kind of like tradition. So I just really like that you kind of spoke to that aspect of higher ed.
I think everyone wants to go home. Thanks for staying this long. We really appreciate it. We didn't know how many people we would have.
Just real quick, and I won't say what tribe, but I know it was with the Bureau of Indian Education, so we would think we would know better. But they needed a native psychologist to go work with a certain tribe, and there were no native psychologists, so they didn't say it like this, but this is the way I felt: is you're Indian, go work with the Indians over there, and everything will work out. Contrary to popular belief, I'm an outsider. In fact, I was treated, non-natives, I felt, were treated better. I came in as, who do you think you are? Are you better than us? And it was a shock for me because maybe I wanted to believe everyone was going to welcome me with open arms. Hey, he's a native psychologist. Hey, come in, brother. The sacred circle. Oh, it was like, you think you're better than us? I was like, what? But even myself and trying to use my words and speak up and advocate for myself was essential, not only for the powers that be at the Bureau of Indian Education, but to also be true to my steps in building that relationship, that trust with the tribe. Again, so what if you're native? You're not one of us. In fact, I think we were enemies, right? But so we need to work together, right, BJ? we need to work together. And just because I'm native, having this assumption that, well, you're native, you go work, everything will work out great. But that we still have an underlying understanding and respecting one another. So I'm proud of you for using your voice and saying it's an honor to be selected, but I also want to honor my ancestors the way I can honor them. So there is a happy medium doing it that way.